because if it happens, well, it's going to be a living hell maybe, right? But if it hasn't happened, which it hasn't, by projecting ourselves into that living hell, we're already suffering the consequences.
Welcome to Awake at the Wheel. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the psychological and social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's so much to cover here, but in general, what we're going to be speaking about are the educational impacts across the different grades and education levels, the impact on relationships, in addition to the impact on various professions. So Oren, where should we start with this?
What about let's say the social impacts, and not the relationships, but more about like connectedness with friends, family, and so on. Let's go with that.
Okay. So as far as the social impacts, and we'll talk a lot, I think, about marriages and just the weirdness that came about from the pandemic. But in particular with isolation, I think that that's a really huge one that really impacted the way in which people are communicating with each other, not communicating with each other, and socially as well. I noticed, and I think there's some research that supports it, that that's when the beginning of this, I suppose, excessive divisiveness in opinions really was highlighted.
Well, yeah, there's so many factors that are intersecting. So it's hard to isolate them, but I would say the isolation itself, no pun intended. We know for a fact that as social animals, one of the worst things that you can do is keep us from somebody else. Solitary confinement is a form of torture. It's been banned in any civilized country
Right.
after a certain period of time because of the impacts it can do. It can truly either exacerbate, let's say, precarious mental health or cause poor mental health. And even if people say, well, you have the internet, you can communicate that way, still, because we're social animals, because our brains don't change that quickly with technology, that it's a good, let's say, simulation of connectedness, but it's not the same. It's not like having somebody there, feeling your oxytocin levels rise when you're connected with them, like eye to eye. It doesn't happen over the screen. That's the same as when you're in person.
Right.
So yes, that and by doing that, and by making even more, like we've been going this direction anyway, about being more and more and more communicating electronically, virtually, right?
Yeah.
More so than in face to face in many cases.
Yeah.
But this sped it up even more. And as you were saying, that it led to more divisiveness because if I say something that's hurtful or offensive to your face, I see the impact that it has on you.
Yeah.
But if it's all online or some anonymous stranger, I don't see that. So I act with impunity.
Yeah.
And I don't have that natural inclination that humans have to go, whoa, whoa, I got to slow down, or I've got to be more compassionate or empathetic.
These natural pieces of social interaction we're missing.
Exactly. So I think that was a huge part of it. And I mean, that's just like, that's on a biological level, basically.
Yeah.
But then on the social psychological level, in the last number of years, FOMO, fear of missing out, has been such a huge concern for many people. In this case, it's kind of like fear, not even fear, it's recognition that society is missing out.
Yeah.
So many young people feel that they've been robbed, and they were robbed, for over a year of being able to engage in these social activities that up until COVID, at least in modern times, we just took for granted, and it was part of our natural development.
Absolutely. And things that stand out to me are things like graduations and proms and these really important milestones that people just completely missed out on. But to talk about socially, and I do want to get into relationships and what's changed in that respect, or what's happened in that respect. You mentioned, I think, the word acceleration just moments ago, and that reminds me of crisis and disaster are the great accelerators of relationships. So if there was a problem brewing in that relationship, being in confinement with one another, being around each other 24/7 is going to accelerate that. Conversely, I think that if a relationship had a good, solid foundation, although there was certainly, difficulty and turmoil to work through in what was this pandemic and isolation and so on, I feel that it would have accelerated those good qualities as well and really forced people to work together.
It forced people to work together, and it also showed them the value of being together, of having dinners together, of
Mhm.
having game nights together,
Yeah.
whether it's two people, whether it's a family,
Yeah.
because we took a lot of this for granted.
Yeah.
And right, and especially in today's world, with families where kids have like 20 different activities in the week and so on, and parents are like ordering out, and
Yeah.
kids are like having them all sit down. It helped people shift their perspective.
Right.
A lot of people's values changed,
Yeah.
some for the good, some for the bad. In a previous podcast, we talked about how a lot of people are losing the work ethic.
Yeah.
So, which we'll probably touch upon today as well. But the fact is, uh, we couldn't. It happened, regardless of how you think that your government handled it, or the media, whatever.
Mhm.
Those are outside of our control,
Absolutely.
right? We were subjected to things. Some of them were, well, most of them I would hope would be were supposed to be in our best interest, even if it didn't play out that
Yeah.
way. The reason I'm saying that is we can control how we react to these situations.
Yes.
And if we feel, well, this is the government, just the authoritarian boot of tyranny stamping down our
Yeah.
rights and everything, that might have some merit and truth to it.
Right. But ultimately, we have no control over that.
We have no control over it. And if we say, okay, I have no control over that, but let me see what I do have control over.
Yes.
How am I going to adapt to this?
Yeah.
How am I going to try to strengthen relationships, either virtually or with this my circle of my close circle, whatever we
Yeah.
called them before. We had those bubbles or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, those bubbles,
Yeah.
especially online, people's bubbles
Mhm.
became even more deeply. They became more deeply entrenched in those bubbles,
Yeah.
where it became more of an us versus them.
Yes. Yes.
And again, that's because instead of adapting to the situation in a healthy way, a lot of people were overreactionary. They were looking for their quote unquote tribes. They wanted to find like minded people. They wanted to either shit on somebody because that
Mhm.
person is wearing a mask, or shit on them because they're not wearing a
Right.
mask, right? There were all these factors that were happening in other contexts, but COVID was the perfect storm that just, again, as you said, accelerated everything.
Yes. Yes. And with respect to families, my gosh, the triple duty, if not more than that, that people were doing, working from home, helping their children with online school, being home 24/7, that surely did a lot to people psychologically, socially, emotionally, and so on. But specifically, I know that there's a lot of research emerging right now about what this did to marriages, specifically with regard to intimacy and sex in general. Some found that early in the pandemic it was great, and back to what disaster does. Disaster and the fear of loss can often bring people close together and energize them and so on. But as it persisted, I think that kind of dwindled down, and people got tired of it, and frankly tired of each other.
Right. They habituated to each other,
Yeah.
which, just to go on a little side note there, the greatest myth that people have is like, if when we're dating, we can only see each other once a week, or if we're lucky.
Yeah.
When we move in together, oh, things are going to be different. We're going
Yeah.
to be having sex all the time because
Yeah.
right. It's like, no, again, you habituate to each other,
Yeah.
so that drive reduces. And again, if you're
Hmm.
forced together
Yeah.
24/7, and it's not just forced together, but as you say, adapting to all these other things,
Yeah.
work responsibilities, losing friends, and so on, it's a lot of stress. And the person that you're closest to,
Yeah.
they are like, they're there during the worst times,
Yeah.
and they can be the recipient of your inability
Hmm.
to handle it properly, and so
Yeah.
on. And so, yeah, it did have a huge impact on a lot of relationships,
Hmm.
whether it's romantic relationship or family.
Yeah.
And family can also include with, let's say, elderly parents,
Hmm.
where an elderly parent, for example, would say, no, like, don't come over
Yeah.
because of,
Yeah.
or there's half the family says, we're okay, we
Hmm.
trust each other. The other half is like, no, no, we're not going to do this. And people took it personally. Most people, I would say, and I don't have stats for this, but I would argue with what I've seen, I think most people did not handle it as well as they could have. And I
Hmm.
wouldn't expect them to. This was
Well, there was no
unprecedented.
roadmap for it,
No
is the
roadmap.
thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm not criticizing anybody for that. I'm just pointing out as fact,
Yeah.
right? That a lot of people had a hard time handling it. And now, months, later,
Hmm.
a lot of people are still having a hard time,
Yeah.
and they're still harboring resentments. And I've told so many patients, I said it during the pandemic, or during the lockdowns,
Yeah.
when I was still meeting with people virtually, where I said, I'm giving everybody, and I'm telling people to give everyone a pass,
Hmm.
whether they're paranoid about about COVID, sorry,
Hmm.
or whether they're on the opposite end and they think everyone else is too paranoid.
Hmm.
I said, we need to give everyone a pass, with exceptions, of course, because
But some grace
with some grace.
at
Yeah,
very least,
a
yeah.
bit of grace and benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
And but I said the fact is I can't say that everyone else is doing that as well. So I said to people, if this is someone that you value, try to see how they acted or what they said
Yeah.
through the lens of poor adapting to this unprecedented situation, and reach out. Don't
Yeah.
expect them to be have some self agency, be proactive,
Mhm.
reach out and see if it's possible to mend. And I said, there are going to be many people who, over that course of the period, because of all the factors we just mentioned and
Right.
others,
Yeah.
they shifted. Their perspectives
Yeah.
changed, their
Yeah.
personalities, their priorities changed. And
Mhm.
maybe you're not that priority, or maybe they see you in a different light or whatever. And be prepared to lose, friends, family, or whatever, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But that's about adaptability. If that's a
Yeah.
reality, don't fantasize, don't rely on wishful thinking, don't avoid it. See what's there, see
Mhm.
which relationships are still intact, see which ones can be mended and
Yeah.
improved, and the ones that can't be, jettison them, get rid of them
Yeah.
in a tactful, high road way,
Mhm.
and focus on what you can salvage or
Right.
strengthen.
And in a more negative light, I think what happened with a lot of friendships too is that people saw things in their friends that
Mm,
maybe they weren't aware of before. So, their opinions or their political views or, you name it when it comes to COVID, it kind of, went across the spectrum of different issues. But I think a lot of friendships were lost in that respect too, because people didn't really know um, how their friends were or thought or whatever the case may be.
right. And you said a few minutes ago, I think there was an absence of grace.
Hmm.
People just were not willing
Yeah.
to give them, and they were willing to make the worst interpretations, or to hear one thing from their friend about COVID and then assume they suddenly had a prototype of a certain
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
If you act this way, it must mean that A, B, C, D, and E are true of you as well.
Yeah.
Again, no grace.
Yeah. Yeah. So to shift gears a bit to, education
Mm,
and the way that things, vastly change in post-secondary, as I'm sure you saw with the way that you taught and delivered your lectures, but also with little kids and little ones. And emerging research now is showing the stark impact it's had specifically on math skills and reading
right.
skills and how far behind kids are. On a more positive note, though, on that topic, what we're seeing in the clinics, though, is a lot of parents actually had the opportunity to observe
Mm,
the real deficits in their children's learning that they weren't aware of or the school wasn't making them aware of before. So, fortunately, they were able to observe this and kind of catch it earlier on than maybe it would have otherwise.
right. And when we talk about deficits, I don't. This is a whole other topic in which we have touched upon, but also not just what they're not learning, but what they are learning,
Yeah,
or what they're being inculcated with,
sure.
or the attitudes of some of the teachers and so on.
Yeah.
And look, I have one period of time, I had the highest proportion of my patients were teachers,
Hmm.
the good
Hmm.
teachers,
Yeah.
right? I didn't get any bad teachers, I
Yeah.
don't think, right?
Yeah.
Because bad teachers, this was great. They didn't care.
Yeah.
They
They
did
don't
the
care.
bare minimum,
Yeah.
right? It didn't affect them. But the teachers who really wanted their students to learn,
Yeah.
and they saw what was
They
happening
really
to them,
care and they
they
want to improve and yeah.
right, and they want to do right by their students, and they
Yeah.
were stymied by their superiors,
Yeah.
and systems that were in place, and so I feel really bad for them.
Mhm.
But having said all that, there are also a number of teachers who, again, they were exposed. We saw what they were doing,
Yeah.
and a lot of them, and still to this day, here's the problem: after spending a year and a half or however long, depending on your jurisdiction, that they were not in the classrooms, some of them just they lost their motivation,
Yeah.
right? There's like, so now they're in the class and they're barely, they're checked out. They're barely doing anything. So we're not seeing a return to previous ways of teaching. We're not seeing a return to trying to really encourage students
Mhm.
to learn and to grow.
Yeah.
And that's a failure on those individual teachers. And yes, you suffered through COVID, but so did everybody else. If
Mhm.
police officers are going, well, you know what? Like, like, well, police officers had to work they weren't all doing virtual, right? But
Absolutely.
right. But if there was anybody in a really high, even our situation, right? If we thought,
Yeah.
oh, you know what? Yeah, COVID wiped me out. I'm going to go and half-ass it or something
Yeah.
like that. Society can't function that way.
Yeah.
We need people to step up, and students need to step up as well. But students, especially as children, they're not. The vast majority of them are not going to automatically step up. They
Yeah.
need to have teachers and parents to put the expectations on them with compassion and to say, yeah,
Yeah.
we know that this was unprecedented. We
Yeah.
didn't have to go through this.
Mhm.
I'm going to make this a drinking game unprecedented. I've got to think of a better word.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm tired. But the fact is, with compassion and balancing that out and just letting kids know that, yeah, it really was bad. And as you say, you missed out on graduation or this or
Yeah.
that. Okay.
Yeah.
But there'll be other opportunities. And that's the thing. if you dwell, the successful people don't dwell.
Hmm.
They look forward, they look ahead.
Yeah.
And parents have to do their best to teach that to children to say, look ahead to see what's next. Well, I don't
Yeah.
feel prepared for this. Well, everybody's in the same boat as you are.
Hmm.
And, so what you're going into, we hope that it will adapt.
Yeah.
If you're not prepared for, let's say, grade 11 French or something like that, if your previous couple of years, sold you short,
Hmm.
well, you'll hope that the whole system is going to adapt to that.
Yeah.
And if not, then as parents, take responsibility
Hmm.
and don't think your kids are lazy or dumb or whatever.
Right.
Find out but you have to also find out, is it because of the COVID and the teaching, or has your child, just is using this as an excuse? We
Hmm.
need, we need nuance, as we always talk about,
Right.
right? You can't treat every situation the same.
Yeah. At the university level, what are
Mm.
you seeing?
Oh boy. So at the university level, whether it's because of COVID, see, COVID also happened at the time that there was a huge bunch of, like a huge amount of social upheaval.
Hmm.
And so I don't know which one it was. I think it's a confluence of these two factors or several factors. But what I'm seeing is a lot of students, far more than before, who are ill prepared for school.
Yeah.
Now, over the last many years, I've seen a decline in students, let's say, respect for the system, in students' expectation of hard work for themselves.
Hmm.
They've been catered to. And I don't blame them necessarily because, as we've talked about in other podcasts, for the last number of decades, schools, parents, whatever, I think have been failing in their jobs to
Yeah.
raise independent, hardworking, ambitious
Yeah.
students, right? So I saw that decline anyway. But since COVID, I've seen a much greater decline. Like it's
Hmm.
significant. And I said this in a previous podcast
Yeah.
where before I know what my distribution of grades looked like,
Right.
right? And I'm just seeing it get worse and worse and worse. And all within a 2 year period or 3 year period now. So and everyone went through COVID, but I'm still seeing, like with the newest batch of
Hmm.
students, far more students on the lower end
Right.
than I had ever seen before. Now,
Yeah.
is it because schools are passing them too easily? Is it because universities are accepting students on criteria that don't equate with merit and
Hmm.
abilities?
Hmm.
Right? Is it that students were shell shocked from school and they
Yeah.
just don't try as hard?
Or it's the perfect storm.
Or it's the perfect storm,
Yeah.
or they expect special consideration because of what they went through.
Yeah.
And some people are saying, okay, well, like some people are not realizing, okay, that was before, but now we have to start getting on our own feet. Like
Right.
again, it's a perfect storm of all these factors. So I'm seeing that. And having said all that, though, the fact is, like in my classes I teach, they're online still.
Yeah.
But I do a live lecture and then give the video to people. It's up there; they can watch
Yeah.
it. But I'll tell you, I mean, the fact is, some students, their mode of learning is not conducive to doing it online or vice versa, right?
Right. Yeah.
I get that, and I'm not going to besmirch them, and I'm
Hmm.
not going to begrudge them.
Yeah.
It's I feel bad for them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So again, anyone who looks for a simple solution
Hmm.
or a one-sided solution is not doing justice to
Right.
anybody.
Yeah. So you talked a bit about the profession of teaching. So I think it's important for us to look at some other professions. And by no means do I want to exclude any, but the ones that stand out the most to me are, of course, our profession
Right.
as therapists, the healthcare profession, and first responders is one that this hit in an interesting way. But I think there's similarity in these three that I'm mentioning. Um, During the pandemic, and I recognize that I guess we're still in the tail end of it, but during the thick of it, first responders, healthcare professionals, and even therapists, we had to keep the game face on and keep going, right? We were going through it too. The world was upside down for us, but there's people relying upon people in these professions that I'm naming here. And what we're seeing, interestingly, at the clinics now is now that things are settling down and now that people can take a deep breath, we're seeing the true consequence the pandemic had on nurses, on EMS, on police officers, because they had to push through, and now it's hitting them. And I recall actually during the pandemic, you and I spoke a little bit about what I was experiencing, providing leadership to our team, being there for our clients, having to pivot our entire business from mostly in person
Mm.
to online while going through all of it. And I was starting to feel burnt out, starting to feel really overwhelmed with the knowledge of I just have to keep pushing through. So it's almost like there is this delayed response or delayed reaction to the catastrophe everybody else was responding to in that moment.
Right. A delayed response, accumulated response. That's like, yeah.
Yeah.
And as you said, not only did they have to put their game face on, but they were living with a kind of stress. Anyone who had to still deal with the public
Yeah.
when we didn't know what, I mean, some people said they knew all along COVID was not that bad, whatever, but
Sure.
A, we don't know how bad it really was. And B,
Right.
certain people have vulnerabilities,
Yeah.
right? And C, what they're hearing in the media of these, these horror stories.
Yeah.
So when you're every day, it's like saying to somebody, you're working in a room full of asbestos every day.
Yeah.
You might not necessarily see it, but it might be eating away at your lungs or something like that.
Hmm.
So carrying that stress, and it's insidious. You're not even aware of it necessarily, but your body feels it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so now afterward, it was that plus also public perception.
Hmm.
Each profession that you mentioned, well, especially the first responders and
Yeah.
nurses and
Yeah.
doctors,
Yeah.
right? Some saw them as heroes and they loved that fueled them. Others saw them in a negative light.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How dare you demand us to wear masks, or
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, all of these things. It's again, this has never happened before, at least in modern history. And I, from a professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective, I really hope that people can step back and say, we shouldn't expect, heroics from people,
Yeah.
right? That's what I said about, giving benefit of the doubt and so on, because this, once again, it was a perfect storm, but this was one of several factors that started tearing society apart. You want
Yeah.
to talk about stress, you want to talk about hopelessness and distress and so
Hmm.
on. Nothing does that than the sense of my land around me is
Right.
being torn apart like an earthquake,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And to that point, natural disasters like earthquakes and disasters in general aren't a new phenomenon. But I think the difference here was it was global. It impacted
Right.
pretty much everybody on our planet. So I think again there was no roadmap per se, and the way in which we psychologically deal with disaster didn't necessarily apply in this situation.
Right. And it's a tough sell what I'm about to say. But I mean, the research is clear on this. And if you do it poorly, it doesn't help. But if you do it the right way, which is gratitude, it's hard to have gratitude when
Yeah.
you're watching your business. By the way, I would not try to say that to somebody if they
Hmm.
just lost their business, their
Of
life
course.
savings,
Of
or a loved
course.
one,
Yeah.
and saying, well, be grateful for. No, bad
Yeah.
timing, not going to work,
Not helpful.
not helpful.
Yeah.
But if in the moments where if it wasn't that tragic, if you can find a little bit of gratitude,
Yeah.
like being in Canada, for example,
Yeah.
we did much better than many other countries.
Hmm.
Supply chain problems weren't that bad for us, whereas it was in other places. Natural disasters don't normally occur here,
Yeah.
like in other places. So the point is even in the darkest of times, if you can try to find a little bit of gratitude, but not for anybody else, but for yourself, because the research shows that when you have that gratitude, if you can embrace it again, even if it's just words at first, it doesn't really work.
Yeah.
But the more you say it, the more you focus on things that you can be grateful for, it buffers against any negative feelings. It may not negate it completely,
Yeah.
but it mitigates it, or mitigates them. So
Yeah.
that's one approach I've tried to help people take. But again, I say it with such compassion and
Hmm.
empathy, and I
Hmm.
and I even tell them, I say, I know it's a tough sell, and I know it's just words right now,
Sure.
but I hope you'll be able to internalize it at some point.
Yeah, and you're not just saying words because we see it all the time in the work that we do and these little micro disasters that people see in their lives, right? So their lives are turned upside down, and I find that the truest healing in therapy begins when people are able to actually pull out those pieces of, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me, but here's something positive that happened as a result that wouldn't have otherwise.
Right. And even if there's not a positive that's obvious to see,
Yeah.
I made it through.
Yeah.
That's a positive, number
You
one, right?
survived, yeah.
I survived it. And then number two, if you shift your perspective, again, it may not be so obvious, but you might find a positive here or there, or you might commit to saying, I'm going
Yeah.
to make a positive something. The funny thing, do you remember at the very beginning, and I remember saying this on TV, where I was an interview when it just started, we had no idea how long it was going to be.
Yeah.
Okay. Where, do you know what the one thing where people are locked in their homes or whatever, almost everybody said, this is the one thing I'm going to work on. Any idea?
One thing I'm going to work
Yeah, and
on.
most people didn't do it, and then he walked out with the opposite, or the
Maybe being organized.
that'd be pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they're talking about like their health.
Okay, that
I'm
was
gonna
gonna be my second guess
yeah,
was fitness. Yeah.
fitness. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm gonna do all this, and then we talked about the COVID-10, the
Yeah.
COVID-15,
Yeah.
the COVID
Yeah.
whatever, right? So again, but it's nothing technically stopped people unless they were sick,
Hmm.
right? You don't need weights, you don't need a treadmill. There are other ways that you could take care of yourself,
Yeah. Yeah.
and if you missed out on doing that during COVID, then again, the perspective shift and say, okay, well, I didn't do as much as I could have now, but I'm going to now commit to not missing out. Okay. Whether it's about
Yeah.
fitness, whether
Yeah.
it's about work, hobbies, connecting with people,
Yeah.
right? And again, as you and I always talk about, I'm sort of taking your words here about what can you do about it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When something is so far out of your control and you're powerless to do anything about it,
Mhm.
find the things around you that you do have control over, healthy
Definitely.
control over.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully we as a society, at least in this lifetime, don't find ourselves in this situation. There's debate that maybe there will be another, but I think, what can we do about it in the future is focus on what we can control, change our perspective, and have gratitude.
Exactly. And yeah, and again, we don't want this to happen again. Something's going to happen again.
Yeah.
We know most
Yeah.
likely, right? And by the way, here's one thing that people have to try to do as well. This is it's a CBT principle or technique,
Yeah.
but for a lot of people, whether it's about the pandemic, whether it's about Ukraine, whether it's about when Trump was elected, okay, people started going down some dark
Yeah. Yeah.
places, right? Whether it's in their mind or whether they're going on the internet and so on. And if you recognize that this is what you're doing,
Yeah.
I say thought blocking, thought stopping, like
Yeah.
just put an end to it,
Yeah.
because it's so easy. Again, it's insidious like that. Someone say, wait, how did I start fantasizing about post-apocalyptic whatever?
Mhm.
And like,
Mhm.
no, stop it, because if it happens, well, it's gonna be a living hell, maybe, right? But if it hasn't happened, which it hasn't, by projecting ourselves into that living hell, we're already suffering the consequences of something.
Of something like that.
Right?
Yeah.
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 So either worst case scenario, we're gonna go through hell twice,
Yeah.
and in the best case scenario, you're gonna go through hell once unnecessarily.
Right.
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 So, and again, gratitude is a good defense against that. Stop it, recognize it. It's an old technique. I have people like put elastic band around their
Yep.
wrist, right? Snap it. I call it snap out of it.
Yep.
Is it like just, and if you don't want to snap yourself, use that band as a thing saying, I should be pulling it, but I'm going to commit to
Yeah.
not doing what I'm doing right now.
But creating that concrete connection between, hey, there's that thought again. Let's
Right.
stop it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that is under your control.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess on that note, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel. As much as we love listening to ourselves speak, especially me, we would love to hear from you as well. So our emails are in the description below. If you would please write to us with your questions, feedback, comments, topics that you would like us to cover. We can do this together, the two of us, but it's much better if we do it together. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we are going to have a segment called Rounds Table, where we're going to discuss the feedback and the questions and so on from our audience, and we will take it to the next level. We're going to help you be able to deal with some of these issues that you might be bringing us, or it's going to be a topic for us to explore together. And we really look forward to building a community of like-minded people who want to do right by others, not just for themselves.